You may have noticed that a few of our latest videos have been about history, or politics if you like. My motive was not to bash anyone, not the Western side nor the Russian one, but to form my own picture of the world and fill in the gaps that arise. Like, for example, to see how the US governs Ukraine, what the West has deceived Russians with, and what is the reason for the outright hysteria of the Baltic states. Don't know about you, but I, personally, and 147 million other folks, weren't taught about such things in Russian schools. All this time I was digging through transcripts, declarations and documents from the past, which I was frankly baffled by. I did not know 90% of the information, and everything you see is solely the result of my digging. And as a consequence, there is no rigid system in this series of videos. Look for yourself. We started with Ukraine of 2014, then jumped to the USSR of the early 90s, then to the late 90s, and then went even further back in time. I mean, if it were a history book, things would need to swap places here. In reality, what happens is this. You go into one topic. In the course of studying it, two more offshoots emerge that are just as relevant, just as important, but require separate videos. And here, for example, I was really surprised and couldn't understand why the Polish president would make such a statement about a recent military alliance ally.
It's also important to remove Russian troops from foreign territory. If you succeed in ensuring that Europe is not again faced with a threat from Russia, you will win a Nobel Prize. After decades of Soviet domination, we're all afraid of Russia.
When I saw this, my topic was not the context of Poland, but the first expansion of NATO. I didn't know the reasons, I just accepted his words without any evaluation. But now with this video I will add, and I stress here first and foremost for myself, another piece of the puzzle. Well, because if you bluntly believe Russian Prime Minister Medvedev's legendarium, Polish officials are degenerates and they owe Russia hundreds of billions of dollars. We're now going to tell you about an event which Soviet-Russian historiography regards as liberation, while the West uses the term occupation. All similarities with modern events are coincidental, or aren't they? The non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin, you probably heard of it under the name of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, occupies an important place in this story. In this treaty, the two countries agreed that they would not attack each other. No violence and aggression, just discussion and negotiation. War sucks, diplomacy rules. All in all, for all the good and against all the bad. It was signed on the 23rd of August 1939. At the time, no one knew about the rather scandalous secret protocol in which the USSR and Germany divided the spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. It says that Poland is divided into spheres of influence between communists and Nazis. God only knows what was meant by the wording, spheres of influence, how to get them, and how in general it is possible to divide a sovereign country in half. You know, like you get the western part and we get the eastern part. There is a position of, why are you clinging onto this secret protocol? It does not say that Germany and the USSR will invade the country and divide it in half, so why are you making shit hit the fan with it? This position sounds strange to me, because if we are just talking about spheres of influence, about an abstract entity which is yours today and ours tomorrow, then such things are simply negotiated in words, and they certainly don't put it under top secret. This raises questions. What is the very territorial and political reorganization of Poland supposed to be about? And why will the borders of the third state be determined by the governments of the USSR and Germany? Before we get too far, the same secret protocol touched the so-called spheres of influence in the Baltics, in the very same context of territorial and political reorganization. Here, another piece of the puzzle was added for those who watched one of our last videos. It now made it clear to you what Molotov was talking about.
The question of the Baltics, Western Ukraine, Western Belarusia, and Bessarabia was resolved with Ribbentrop in 1939. The Germans were reluctant for us to annex Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Bessarabia. When I was in Berlin a year later, in November 1940, Hitler asked me, "All right, you are uniting the Ukrainians, the Belarusians together. All right, the Moldovans. This can still be explained. But how do you explain the whole world about the Baltics?" I told him, "We will explain."
So, a secret protocol was signed on the 23rd of August of 1939. On the 28th of August, it became necessary to meet again and clarify the boundaries of the so-called influence in the Polish Republic by adding another river there. And just 4 days after this clarification, Germany invades Poland.
Coincidence? I think not!
Coincidentally, a few days after the treaty, Germany invades Poland from the west, and a couple of weeks later the Soviets enter from the east. Eventually, Poland is split into two parts between the Nazis and the Communists. As a result of special military operation, the USSR would annex the Polish lands to the Belarusian and Ukrainian SSR in a couple of weeks. Although Germany and the Soviets were moving towards each other, occupying, or, if you like, liberating territory, there were no major conflicts between them that escalated into war. Well, what kind of conflicts could there be between friends? This, by the way, is not my judgment. Hitler invaded Poland on September the 1st. Stalin went in on September the 17th, and on September the 28th, after their special military operation is over, the two goons conclude the Boundary and Friendship Treaty, the text of which begins, well, just brilliantly. It is positioned as if the Polish state had disintegrated on its own, and the peace-loving Stalin and Hitler are bringing peace and order to all nations. But as is usual in politics, the main thing here was the practical part, namely the agreement between the two strong powers as to who owns which territories and which borders. There is no shortage of the secret protocols you are already familiar with. One of them supplements the Non-Aggression Pact, or rather its secret protocol. That is, it is a secret protocol for another secret protocol. And now Stalin takes over Lithuania, thereby the whole of the Baltics. And in the other, as part of establishment of peace and order, it is stated that any Polish agitation will be suppressed. The documents were signed by Molotov and Ribbentrop. But they couldn't sell this to the Soviet population. The population needed a clear and simple version, a version for common people. Here is what the population was told on the day the operation to liberate Poland began.
The events showed the internal insolvency and apparent incompetence of the Polish state. The Polish ruling circles are bankrupt. The people of Poland have been abandoned to their fate by their hapless leaders. A situation has arisen in Poland which calls for special care with regard to security. The indifference on the part of the Soviet government cannot be demanded with regard to the fate of its own kindred Ukrainians and Belarusians living in Poland. The Soviet government considers it its sacred duty to lend a helping hand to its brothers Ukrainians and brothers Belarusians inhabiting Poland. The peoples of the Soviet Union are united as never before around the Soviet government, around our Bolshevik party, around their great leader, around the wise Comrade Stalin.
I read this newspaper with incredible interest because I wondered how they would explain the Nazis' actions. After all, a few days before the invasion of Poland, a treaty to divide it was signed, and at the end of the operation, a treaty of friendship. How to pose such a friend to people? I assume that in public space Germany was made an enemy, although it was not one at that time. And USSR's entry into Poland was a defense against fascism and a preemptive strike. But I was wrong. These theses will emerge somewhat later, backdated. Back then, the approach was even simpler. The first question is, who is the enemy? The enemy has been brought to the forefront, embodied in the Polish government, or rather, not even the enemy, but incompetent managers. Almost immediately they are described as hapless leaders, then as unwise leaders who are powerless and who have ruined the country altogether. The second question is, what about Germany? What place does it have? And Germany is not here at all. Not so much as the blame for its own aggression, but there is simply no mentioning that it entered the territory of another country. The war sort of happened on its own. They are called the events of the Polish-German War, and Poland sort of lost all its industrial hotbeds, most of its major cities and centers, on its own. Warsaw as the capital was gone. It wasn't the Germans who seized it, it was the Poles who lost it, like some AirPods or other earbuds. And besides, it was the Polish leaders who got Poland involved in the war. The German position will not appear in Molotov's speech, but it will appear on page 4. There will be a description, first in an informative format of who seized which areas, but then the Germans are presented as peacemakers who want to prevent bloodshed. And further below is the familiar narrative. Poland has collapsed, and its leaders even wanted to create a military dictatorship there. The third question is, what are Soviets doing there? Well, it's classic. Soviets protect and liberate everyone they can liberate and protect, and the brothers Ukrainians and Belarusians and the Poles themselves to give them a chance to live a peaceful life. Was there even some kind of threat? Of course there was, and its name is accidents and surprises that could pose a threat to the USSR. As you can see, the threat from the Third Reich was not talked about back then. The Soviet state was defending against surprises. And, of course, to increase motivation, they've not forgotten about the sacred duty. Then other sections talked about brotherly help, unity, and the desire to be the first to rush to free. Here the rhetoric became radicalized, to free people from under the Polish Khan's yoke. Well, there's a lot more about how the Holy Red Army is greeted with joy. I'll leave the link to the sources, as always, in the description. You can read it. There you can read other issues of the newspaper, where there are many statements like this, and this. All in all, this is designed to make sure that the population has a stance like, crush 'em all, crush 'em. Well, the authorities couldn't say, of course, something like, we had agreed with Germany and wanted to take the territory in accordance with the treaty, plus protect ourselves from the possible advance of the cunning Nazis further into Poland by taking more than what we had agreed. That is why the theses about liberation, the pan-Polish yoke, and the sacred mission were invented for the common people. Simple, clear, and effective. But then in modern Russia, the version underwent a change. The not-so-clear enemy in the form of hapless leaders and surprises had already retroactively turned into a defense against Wehrmacht troops, or else they would have reached Minsk. This event is called the Liberation Campaign. And for those who have seen the video about the Baltic countries, this phrase of Stalin's on the 28th of September 1939 became much clearer.
The agreement has been reached. I can tell you that the Estonian government acted wisely and for the benefit of the Estonian people in concluding the agreement with the Soviet Union. You could have ended up like Poland. Poland was a great power. Where is Poland now?
After 1939, Poland was effectively erased from the political map of the world. It only returned after the Second World War. Although part of Eastern Germany was given to Poland at the end, the total territory of today is smaller than in 1938. In 1944, it returned to the map in the form of the Polish Republic. Until 1989, it was under the influence of the Soviet Union, and in this case, it was an influence, albeit absolute, but territorially and officially Poland was an independent state. They started to leave socialism only in 1989. At that time, the planned economy and inflation at 50% were replaced by free market and capitalism. The one to lead the transition was an electrician from Gdansk, the president of the time, Lech Wałęsa, who you remember from the video about NATO extension. And from this video, you may remember a detail that I did not pay attention to at the time. But especially important for Poland was the agreement on the withdrawal of Russian troops from its territory. Note, the treaty was already signed by Russia in 1993, but the Soviet troops came in 1939, and they were present there after World War II as well, already in the Republic of Poland. Russian troops left only 30 years ago, after half a century of stationing there. And when President Lech Wałęsa received a report from General Leonid Kowalev on the completion of the withdrawal of Russian troops from Poland, he uttered this phrase.
The day of 17th of September became a painful and ominous date in Polish history, opening a path that led Poles to prisons and gulags, to Katyn, to torment, humiliation and enslavement. Today, precisely on 17th of September 1993, marks the end of an era in our common history. A measure of historical justice has been fulfilled. There are no longer any foreign troops on the territory of the Polish state. The sovereignty of the Republic of Poland is finally confirmed.
When I first heard the word Katyn, I had no idea what it was. But then I remembered that I had seen the word when I was preparing the video about the first NATO expansion, where Poland was particularly active. Remember when Yeltsin came to Warsaw in August of 1993 and Lech Wałęsa got the go-ahead from the President of Russia for Poland to join NATO? That's when Yeltsin said at the Katyn Cross, "Forgive us if you can." Then I wondered what President Yeltsin was apologizing for. It turned out that Katyn was the collective name for the shootings of Polish prisoners of war by the NKVD, and the first remains were discovered in 1943 in the very Katyn forest. In a campaign not of aggression, but of liberation against the oppression of capitalism, the Soviet army captured 240 to 250,000 Polish soldiers. Such numbers of war prisoners posed a threat to the Soviet liberators. Lavrenti Beria wrote directly to Stalin about this.
A large number of former army officers are currently held in NKVD SSR prisoner of war camps and in prisons. They are all sworn enemies of the Soviet authorities, full of hatred for the Soviet system. In the camps for prisoners of war, there are 14,736 former officers, officials, landlords, policemen, etc. There are 18,632 arrested persons in the prisons. Assuming that all of them are hardened, incorrigible enemies to the Soviet regime, the NKVD of the USSR considers it necessary to propose to the NKVD of the USSR the cases of 14,700 people from the camps, as well as the cases of 11,000 persons from prisons, to consider their cases following the special procedure in which capital punishment, an execution by firing squad, shall be imposed on them, to examine the cases without summoning the arrested persons, without charging them, without announcing the end of the investigation, and without issuing a bill of indictment.
We received these documents after Dmitry Medvedev, Russian president at the time, declassified the Katyn case archives in 2010. We also know from this note to Khrushchev that 21,857 people were shot. And after that, it is clear to me what Katyn was Yeltsin apologizing for. Moreover, you will be surprised now, but even Dmitry Medvedev admitted the blame for the USSR and Stalin personally. You would also be surprised that these lines could have been written in a Russian newspaper in 1993.
The last Russian soldier leaves Poland on the very day 54 years ago when Stalin invaded the country. Poles have not forgotten and will never forget that grim day. What is September 17th? Certainly, it is a war crime, another partition of Poland as a result of a conspiracy between two more powerful states. On the other hand, how many people in Russia today have even heard about this date? I wish Russians were more acquainted with history. Many people believe that the Second World War began in 1941.
This video is first and foremost my personal study of history, which has become somewhat more relevant the past year. It's important for any country, and for Russia in this specific case, to accept its history and try not to deny it, even though it is embarrassing, to say the least, which Russia doesn't even assume to attempt to. It's much easier to rewrite whatever history there was, to make up delusional excuses to invade other countries, to make its own people believe it's for the right cause. Without knowledge of the past events and acceptance of its consequences, one cannot truly understand the present and make considerable steps for progress in the future. You know who to share this video with. We say a big thank you to the guys who support us on Patreon. And I'm the researcher.